Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to give you my way too early tier list for Season 2. While we still have about, 4 or 5 weeks or so until the next season drops, a lot of people were curious as to where specs stand at the moment. And, of course, before we get all of our final tuning, I want to just kind of talk about where specs stand and also what we're going to be encountering in the Season 2 dungeons. Now that we've finally been able to do all of the dungeons, what I've really noticed has been there's not a huge impact on, curses or diseases. There's a few of them, but a lot of them are able to be healed through or defensive through to survive. There's very few poisons, actually, which is a really big surprise since most seasons have a lot of them. This only really has poisons featured, I want to say, in Motherlode, and they're interruptible as well. So you don't have to deal with a ton of those, but there's an insane amount of bleeds in the incoming season, meaning prio healing is going to be incredibly important on a lot of trash packs. And then on a lot of boss fights, there's still a lot of burst AoE like we've seen in Season 1. A lot of the healer checks and a lot of the really difficult areas to heal are going to be pretty familiar to you from what you've seen already in Season 1. What this really means for our tier list is that overall healer output is going to be massive for the incoming season. The best healer, the #1 factor to determine the best healer in the new season is going to be their healer output, which is a big reason why it's too early to definitively say what the best is going to be, since the top spec in Season 1, Disc Priest, only got their buffs that made it #1 a week or two into the actual season. So our way too early tier list is, of course, going to be based off of those factors. And while it is too early for a perfect tier list to make sure you know what to do, it's never too early to learn a new skill in our new year. And that's why our sponsor for today's video, Boot.dev, is here to teach you backend web development from start to finish in both Python and Go's programming languages. The best way to learn in WoW is by doing, and Boot.dev feels the same way. Their focus is not only on just delivering the content to you, but making sure that you're understanding what you're learning and making sure you're able to practically apply it into real projects as you are progressing throughout their lessons. Their platform is built like an immersive RPG game, giving you stats, giving you an unlockable spell book, for example, so that on your learning journey, you'll be able to have access to cheat sheets and multiple links and notes to give you some key reminders as you're going through later lessons. They also have their AI Bear Boots, which is always around to be able to help you and assist you with any sort of questions. They so heavily believe in their product that all of their content is free to read and watch in guest mode. The paid membership, of course, is going to unlock the interactive features like the hands-on coding, AI assistance, progress tracking, and some of the elements for the game itself. So there's never been a better time to check out Boot.dev and save 25% with our code AutomaticJak. Huge thank you to Boot.dev for sponsoring this video, and let's continue. To start off our tier list, we've got Disc Priest at the top, and this shouldn't be too big of a surprise if you've seen some of our previous videos through the content coverage. They have done a really good job of making it so that Disc is going to be very consistent in terms of bringing its overall output to the table on a consistent basis, still playing around your pet, and still playing a very similar format into what you might be used to if you played in Season 1, but some of the changes going into it are pretty neat. For one thing, you have a very consistent cooldown reduction for your pet, your Mindbender, Void Wraith, whatever you want to call it. It's now 50% flat with the Void Summoner talent adjustments they made, so it's very easy to actually plan around when you're going to have it next. Now, the downside to this is that you no longer are going to have the Lust or PI benefit, where more smites during these heavy haste windows will kind of bail you out of a bad use or something. So you have to really think and drill down as to when you're using your cooldown, but when you do, you are incredibly strong. You're getting around 50% uptime or so from my experiences on PTR with Shadow Covenant, which is around in line with what you can get today with a good amount of haste. Your Rift uptime is still hasted with your Mind Blast cooldown being reduced by the amount of haste you have, so haste is still going to be a strong stat. Our dots have gotten quite a lot better, and Expiation in particular feels like a very good talent to take these days, not only providing really good healing for when you're jumping around between your dots and kind of just munching them up with Mind Blasts or Shadow Word Deaths when you have a lot of targets, but it's also really powerful on single target and makes your executes feel really strong, which is something they were, okay in Season 1, but they didn't feel as noticeable. Now with the Expiation talent on hand, they feel very, very noticeable, and it feels like you have more capabilities really than ever before to kind of muscle heal whenever you get into execute. Now you do lose Rapture, which is pretty unfortunate. There's not really any replacement for just getting a ton of awesome shields from the ability, but with it gone, you kind of have two things replacing it. You have Ultimate Penitence, which you can now move in, and you have a larger shield to protect yourself, which means you can kind of utilize it as a defensive for yourself at very key moments, which is amazing. It's a decent healing cooldown, but it's still not as strong as having like your Shadow Covenant and your Rift going and a fat penance or anything like that, but it's pretty good. I think the biggest benefit to it would be using it at a moment where you don't have your pet, but you do have defensives for your team, and that'd be a really good way to have a moderate healing cooldown up while people are using defensives, and you have almost a full immunity with 100% HP shield. You also are going to have access to Evangelism, which is a little strange to use in a dungeon environment because it produces about like 8 million healing on a 1.5 minute cooldown split between everybody that has Atonement. So if you have 5 players in a group, you might get 1.5 mil or 2 mil, which doesn't sound great, but there's 2 great ways to use it. One is using it as an AoE heal for the wealth of knockbacks and movement mechanics where you can't sit there and pound smites. The other way to utilize it is actually as a spot heal, which is strange. Now, there's not a lot of times where you're going to have Atonement on nobody, but there are a few, especially when you can plan around some of those incoming bleeds like we talked about at the beginning of this video, when you might have a burst of AoE from a trash pack, you heal it up and then your atonements are falling off, but there's bleeds coming. This is the opportunity to specifically apply atonement to 1 or 2 people, and then when they start taking some damage, you can activate Evangelism, and that 8-ish million healing is then filtering only into those 2 targets. If you get really fortunate, then you could put an atonement on 1 person and then hit Evangelism, and it's like a lay on hands, but that's a little harder to leverage consistently in a dungeon environment. Needless to say, while Evangelism's weird to use at first, it's a very good flex cooldown that can kind of fit into a few different areas and have some good impact. Your defensive penance, while you won't frequently use it, is actually not bad at all if you have to or if you feel like you need to. It's something where you're probably going to use penance mostly for damage to keep on spreading around your dots or probably extending them on like a single target boss fight, but the ability is there and it doesn't suck, which is nice, which is really, really nice that defensive penance doesn't suck. They have a lot of really good tools for the incoming dungeon pool. Needless to say, disc and their overall healing output is still looking very strong, and it will probably continue because it has an independent modifier in dungeons. If you look at the atonement tooltip that says, hey, you heal for 100% more. Now, notably, this was like 70% at the beginning of the expansion. They buffed it up to 100%, something like that. I would not be shocked if they nerfed it a little bit, but the healing profile is still really strong. And since there is that tuning knob that exists, even if there is a nerf, I would be shocked if they nerfed it so much that the spec still wasn't powerful or like on the very good scale. But at the moment, it is an absolute blaster. Now, Mistweaver has been really the next one up in Season 1, and I think in a lot of cases that trend is continuing going into Season 2 and could be a major beneficiary if Discipline receives a couple of nerfs. One of the biggest things with Mistweaver is they've revamped how Crackling Jade Lightning is working. So if you only play the beginning of the expansion, let me explain. There is an ability that's a talent called Jade Empowerment that after you cast Thunder Focus Tea, it does not consume the Thunder Focus Tea buff, but just after you use Thunder Focus Tea on whatever, it is going to empower your next Crackling Jade Lightning to deal huge damage to your primary target and then to 4 other targets. They've been kind of readjusting the tuning of it and how much damage to the primary and to the cleave and all that fun stuff. But basically, that damage converts into healing through your Jade Fire teachings. So you can have your Fey line down, activate your lightning, and it's going to do immense amounts of damage onto a single target and cleave off onto enemies. When you cleave and when you hit all of these enemies, it's going to heal all of your buddies for a ton. It is a healing cooldown in and of itself. Now, when you're fighting on single target, it does pretty good at healing moderate levels of damage, but it's not going to be your highest HPS ability if you're using Crackling Jade on like a single target. It's pretty good, but it won't carry you. That being said, Mistweaver's got a lot of different ways that their output can carry them through disasters or big damage or anything like that. Revival's a decent cooldown. Shayloon's is a very good cooldown with a low stack generation rate. You're having it up very consistently, like every 20-30 seconds. And they made some adjustments to some of your celestial cooldowns. Now, I really like the change they made to Jade Bond. Chi-Ji is now a 2-minute cooldown. And on top of that, Jade Bond allows your Chi Cocoons, when they expire or are consumed, to place envelops on everybody in your party. It feels super insanely powerful when like you use it before a big damage event, all the shields break and everybody gets enveloped, and then you can just start topping everybody. But on a 2-minute cooldown, it's not quite what you're looking for with some of the frequency of heavy damage going on in these dungeons. There's a lot of like 30-second burst or 45-second burst mechanics, and so you likely would default over to the 1-minute Chi-Ji, just like we've been running before, which is still really strong. In fact, they've made it so that the gust of mists that you are triggering on a single target is actually stronger than before, since there's no focus on the cleave element at a blackout kick. And so Chi-Ji gets better, your lightning gets better, your damage is still really strong. Like I mentioned, there's not really a lot of poisons in the dungeons except for like Motherlode, and that you could just kick because you have a kick. The physical vulnerability doesn't really bring a lot to the table, at least from what I've seen so far from the DPS, as that it can always change. But might I remind you, in Dragonflight Season 3, Mistweaver was the meta healer with an almost 0 physical damage composition, so not too big of a deal if they don't actually get it. Battle reses are really easy to leverage these days, and of the healers I've tested, I believe Mistweaver is still the highest DPS out there. I don't think DPS is the biggest factor. I think it's always going to be about burst healing, at least in the current meta that we live in. But Mistweaver brings a lot to the table and is looking incredibly strong going into the next season. The next tier of healers is going to be like the good tier, some that are kind of like a step away from being in the meta for one reason or another. Resto Druid is kind of the top of my mind on this list, as notably they were brought to MDI in Season 1 because they did so much damage, brought Heart of the Wild, and were just generally efficient for the key levels you saw there. Well, a lot of the changes for Druid were focused on like the class tree element. They did get some overall changes which feel pretty good to play around. The symbiotic relationship on their class tree, being able to like beacon a target and then you're able to have healing flowing from one to another, is pretty helpful, and it's one of those like noticeable slight increases in your survivability. It's almost like just having extra leech on your character, which feels quite nice. Can also be utilized if you know that there's a lot of pressure on like another person in the group. If somebody has like substantially less defensive strength than somebody else, it could be a really good flexible talent to utilize. They did make Trank and Divine Hymn easier to cast, like basically channeling quicker, but that's not something I think you're really going to utilize in a dungeon environment. It felt okay, but in a lot of cases it also felt like an extra mastery stack that you had as well. Finally, on the third iteration of the mastery change that we've had this expansion, their healing actually does feel like you can ramp up and build up your healing very quickly instead of needing 50 million hots to actually blast. So at the moment, they've made it so that with 4 hots or less, your mastery is actually doing more healing than it used to, but then your peak HPS, for example, if you were in like a rot fight and you had the time to set up all of these hots onto everybody at like 5 or 6, you might be doing slightly less than before. But in general, it's a pretty good trade-off since you're not stuck having to like reapply all of your hots 24/7. It is still really brutal not having something like Flourish in the game. Well, technically for our druid, since you're taking photosynthesis instead in dungeons because you just need to have it. So there still is some moments where it feels like you're more GCD intensive to set up your healing in advance than some healers. I mean, notably, like it's 3 steps basically for a Disc Priest to set up their healing, but you have to be individually applying rejuves to your allies as you're setting up for bursty situations. It does feel pretty good having Convoke on hand and like the Grove Guardians to kind of support you, but they still feel like a little bit too weak. It's really important to make great use out of your Swiftmends to extend the duration of all of those haunts on the target that you're placing it on. And when you do, it feels like your single target in particular and your capacity to deal with bleeds is incredibly strong. And you top that off with like 1 minute Bark Skin and your own, like, you know, good enough defensives. In a lot of cases, I think our Druid does a good job of both being able to survive some of the big hits that are coming in these dungeons, and when they know the damage is coming, to have a wealth of resources to start like muscle healing through a lot of the problems. Downside is that the 2 healers above it are naturally dealing damage while they are healing, which is something Druid doesn't really do, or isn't doing as effectively, I should say. Some of like the Dream of Cenarius talents that we've been able to take advantage of are like okay, but they really only deal with like low to like moderate levels of healing. Kind of when like the danger is past for a mechanic and no other danger is present, then you can start kitty weaving and doing a bit of damage and like top people if you wanted to run those talents, but not nearly on the level that you would see at a like Mistweaver or Disc Priest. So I do think that there's a few different things that have kind of eroded Druid's capacity in dungeons. One of which is just overall healer balance, overall output balance. Monk has some talents like the Jade Empowerment, which we referenced earlier, that ramps up their healing when they have the Crackling Jade Lightning. Disc has an independent modifier for their atonement, which increases their atonement in dungeons. Druid doesn't really have any of those things. And it used to be this healer that was so much better than others historically because it was able to focus its healing into 5 allies really effectively, which other healers could not. Times have changed since then. Like I mentioned, healers getting talents that are focused on 5-mans that burst up their output. And I feel like Druid and some of the other healers we'll talk about a little bit later are kind of in that boat where they're missing that talent that helps them better amp up their healing in a 5-man environment. And there's a lot of shared talents that, of course, if they buff them up too much, then the spec would be too good in raids, and they don't want that to happen. So it's kind of like a raid first mentality, I think, with overall tuning that some healers are sort of able to not take part in or are not punished by, but then others are kind of weighed against it. I think Druid's in like a pretty good position, and with like a buff or 2, they could actually be going into the top position, I think, for the incoming season, but right now they're a little bit on the outside. On the side of Preservation Evoker, a lot of the changes were focused into like updating and sort of streamlining some of the Flame Shaper talents, which I gave a shot in the dungeon environment, but it didn't feel nearly as good as still playing with Chrono Warden. One of the biggest changes that Preservation just had was that they're now able to echo their Verdant Embraces to then apply Insurance to all of their allies. Insurance is the new tier set bonus, which is basically a hot, but if they drop below 50%, the hot insta triggers a direct heal to them. So it's a nice effect, and now that you can Temporal Anomaly into a Verdant Embrace, you get Lifeline on everybody, you get Insurance on everybody. It's a nice healing increase, especially for dungeons, allowing you to more focus your output into specific allies when you need to. It's nice to be able to have that access, but Prez honestly kind of feels like it's a lot of work and a lot of setup for a reduced reward. In a lot of cases, you still have very powerful lifeline ramps, you still have very powerful combos that you're able to set up, but needing to play around all these passives and all these other resources and sort of putting in all of this preemptive work, it feels like it's actually more setup and more effort in a lot of cases than Disc, which is known to be the healer that's supposed to be all about the setup. So there's a lot of like punishment if you're messing up your sequencing or not taking advantage of your empower abilities properly, which hasn't really changed from last season, but it doesn't feel like the reward is really quite there. And similar to where Resto Druid was earlier in our tier list, there still is some punishment going on for being balanced around raid and not having an independent modifier that allows them to just kind of burst a little bit higher. Augmentation is always going to be in the conversation with Prez because a lot of groups are only going to want to bring one Evoker. And so you're naturally going to find these moments where, okay, I want to play Prez, but how good is Aug? At the moment, Aug no longer buffs healers and tanks, which makes it so it's not a guaranteed bring to the group. But in order to compensate for that, they very heavily buffed its overall damage, meaning that at the moment, it looks like it's going to be a lock, but we don't know for sure with the overall tuning setup. If we were to not bring a augmentation evoker, and let's assume that like Dev is not in the equation, would it be enough to bring Prez? to the table, I would say not right now, even though they'd be like a solid pick. I think the healing output is probably one of the most noticeable things, in that it's not bad, it's just a lot of work to set up, but also not as rewarding as you would see out of like Disc and Mistweaver. It's at a good level, and I don't want to like dissuade anybody from playing it if, you know, the highest they do every season is going to be like 12s or something, but we've kind of gotten into this like hyper meta environment where it's very easy to re-roll, and people are noticing that overall healer output is having a much wider range in a dungeon environment than you would expect. Now, there's a difference between like healing trash pulls, for example, and then healing boss fights. I'm really talking about the most challenging boss fights are going to have the most challenging healer checks, and these are the areas where a healer can either carry or start struggling quite a lot. And it's a very noticeable difference in how well healers can deliver that output, even though they might have similar overall numbers at the end of a dungeon. Prez has the healing profile to deal with this burst damage, but a lot of cases you have a couple powerful cooldowns, a couple powerful combos on hand, and then when you're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel and you don't have, you know, your Emerald Communion or Stasis or a couple Empower abilities, you might only have like a Spirit Bloom in some of the Chrono Warden setups you would have. It may not be enough to start pushing through some of the consistent burst heavy mechanics that you're having in this incoming season. It's fun to play, but it definitely has this sort of divide between its output right now and the setup and like work required to put it together, and also could be quite punishing if you mess it up. There hasn't been a lot of talk about Restoration Shaman in season 2, and that's really because the changes have been light to negative in a lot of cases. Losing Ancestral Guidance, I know, is not a huge favorite for a lot of Shaman players, but a lot of the other changes have also been focused on like bringing up Farseer Shaman. And Farseer is not bad by any means, but it's just more work for like kind of the same output as Totemic. Whereas Totemic, you have a much more consistent healing rain. They've reduced the mana cost of the surging totems. You're not all the time. You still have to drink a little bit. You still have to think about your mana, but it really revolves around Riptides, lots of surges, and letting your totems cast the chain heals for you. And not too much has really been changed or adjusted, even with the new tier sets we have on hand. Its output is good. Its get out of jail free card with Spiritling Totem is still very good. There's a couple of actual like rot fights, which are going to feel fun to play in. And you've got some good defensives. The problem really kind of comes down to your ability to just burst, because Shaman has done a really good job at dealing with like steadier damage, and it can reverse some burst when it procs its High Tide and you have, you know, some very powerful chain heals to unleash, which might get buffed by your Ascendance or something like that. That being said, you don't really have a lot of power behind it. You know, Disc, for example, has like the 30-second pet that you can always be blasting. Mistweaver kind of alternates between like 1 minute and 30-second cooldowns, like very quick, punchy abilities. The healing profile in dungeons has been very bursty in nature, and that only continues in infinitely scaling content. And it feels like Shaman kind of lacks a good way to sort of burst through a lot of its problems. Because when you're casting Chain Heal without all of the additional modifiers that make it strong, like High Tide, doesn't really hit very hard. And so hard casting a Chain Heal to try to like muscle heal through your problems rips your mana to shreds and doesn't really do a ton of output on its own. So you're kind of pushed into casting more surges and playing around more single target while you lean on your totems to carry the AoE. But if you don't have your totems on hand, you can kind of start fighting this losing battle of attrition on certain encounters. And so Shaman, I think, is going to do extremely well in this pug environment. I think it's at a good level. I think it's a step away from getting into that meta level or something along those lines. Might just be something that's output related if they were able to effectively sort of balance out everyone's overall healing numbers. That being said, I think it's still going to be in this like good bracket, but not great onto that one. Holy Priest has been really fun to play in 11.1, but unfortunately I'm gonna have it at around like a decent tier, at least at the moment. Some of the big changes that happened for 11.1 was basically to make it so that Renew and Prayer of Healing are going to be better abilities, and at the time of this video that still hasn't happened yet. They still have not been able to really bring these abilities into the spotlight, and make them more effective. Now on Renew side, they made an Empowered Renew talent, which makes it good to cast if you want more Sanctifies, because they made their Holy Words a lot better, and they made Apotheosis a lot better, which are not negatives by any means, but it sort of detracts away from their overall goal of making Prayer of Healing and Renew actually good. So there's times where you would want to cast Renew, especially when you're in between pulls and you're walking from pack to pack, since it gives you Sanctify back more quickly, and it's going to give a better hot to whoever you place it on, which can be decent. That being said, a lot of the power for the spec is just based in Apotheosis right now. I was playing with both Archon and with Oracle. I like them both really for different reasons. Archon has a passive in it where it increases your healing while you're inside Apotheosis, which is always great. You can even play a Sustained Potency, which is one of the hero talents for Archon, which maintains your Apotheosis if you drop combat, and it gives you like a 20-second window or something like that of Apotheosis uptime that only starts when you get into combat once again. This is really nice for playing an Apotheosis focus build where you use your Holy Words to extend the duration of your Apotheosis, your Halos extend your Apotheosis, and you kind of just always have this big meaty cooldown up to deal with the heavy problems. That being said, it falls short really heavily on boss encounters. It feels really good on trash, kind of jumping from pack to pack. But on boss fights, you can only extend this buff for so long. And then eventually it drops, and then so too does your healing. Halo with Archon in dungeons is like good, but not great. And one of the reasons I like Oracle is it gives you another cooldown with Apotheosis to kind of lean upon with the Piety setup, which is like a 20-ish% healing boost, and the Overheal protection, where you can use the Seedling tech and GS yourself and start spamming healing into yourself to AoE heal your allies. That works decently well up to a certain key level, and then there's some moments, of course, where it can start kind of dropping off as you get into higher level keys. Anyone who played Holy Priest in Season 1 will kind of know what I mean when they start dealing with some of that really heavy burst damage. That being said, I would say that Holy Priest is kind of a, I don't know, I would put it at a decent level because I think it's more than just a healing output problem that the spec faces. It's also just how they deliver their healing is a little bit too slow for what higher level keys bring to the table. It's going to be totally fine for like 12s and below. The issue is really going to be that like when people see that high keys are being done by this spec, they think it's going to be easier for them. In some cases it is, and then they start bringing that, and then we have the trickle down effect, right? In a lot of cases, once you kind of run out of your Holy Words, you're needing something else to sort of bring you up, and Lightweaver still feels pretty good. Trail was bugged for a while and making you do like infinite HPS. Once they actually fix that bug, people will kind of see that there's a bit of a lingering HPS problem in dungeons because it can't just properly balance between raid and M+ overall healing. And overall healing and the healing profile where you can focus that healing into the burst damage moments are the most important factors for the best healer in the incoming season. There's a lot of times where it doesn't seem like you need to bring a healer for a kick, or you need to bring a battle res, you need to bring this dispel profile. The moment it really is starting to come down to that overall output, and Holy Priest has a few different good options, but they don't feel great, or they don't feel like they're going to be blasting at the moment. I would really like to see some more talents that are just solely focused on 5-man healing that would allow to be better tuning knob on hand. I would love to see certain talents, for example, just be better suited for 5-mans, like with Prayer of Healing, because the spec really heavily lacks for AoE, making it so that Resonant Words, which is a 40% increase to your next flash heal, or I believe it's also Prayer of Healing now that they made with the changes, is a good idea, but 40% bonus healing on Prayer of Healing is still really, really weak, unfortunately. And so I am a little concerned about where Holy Priest stands in M+, at least at the moment. To round us all off, I've got a tragedy to talk to you about with Holy Paladin. Now, a lot of the changes they made with Holy Pally, I think, are actually not bad, and they're a little controversial, but I at least appreciate them. What they've done is they've made it so that the missing pieces of your toolkit, if you've played Lightsmith, Avenging Crusader, Paladin in Season 1, they're like, hey, let's try to even out some of these things. Hey, you have too many Infusion of Light procs from your Holy Shock crits. Let's make them so you have a reason to use them, right? So they've taken some power out of very passive abilities like Greater Judgment, and they've put them into your Holy Light and your Flash to make it so it's actually worth to cast those spells. Now, you're not becoming caster Paladin or anything like that. It costs way too much mana to do that. But occasionally being able to deliver those Holy Lights that are buffed by Divine Favor from casting your Holy Prism, by casting your Holy Light when you have an infusion up, they feel very powerful and very rewarding. That being said, they've been steadily eroding the strength of Lightsmith, which impacts Holy Pally a lot. I'm sure a lot of it was aimed at Prot, but Holy Pally kind of catches it in the crossfire. Herald of the Sun, while it is fun and feels pretty good to utilize, it still has a lot of its power built up into its laser beams. And there's a lot of strength in being able to have the laser beams on all your allies and ticking away for healing for them when they're all stacked. But this is a very, very similar issue that they ran into in the Race to World First, is that like other specs can do stacked healing better. Other specs can do the sort of Avenging Crusader, Lightsmith burst healing better. And Pally also feels like it's very heavily taxed for having Devotion Aura, which in a dungeon environment is okay, and the Aura Mastery use of it is pretty good, but it's not so powerful that it's going to be carrying you the way it would in a 20-man raid environment. The difference in having Aura Mastery being used for a 20-man and the effect it has on the healing overall is way different than a dungeon environment, but you're taxed in the same way. As a result, Holy Pally is kind of bringing up the decent level, but in a lot of cases, I found that I would have Wings up, I would even Divine Toll during my Wings, playing either Herald or Lightsmith AC, and I still would be running out of output. It would be ridiculous to play around. I really enjoyed how the tier set interacted with Divine Toll, placing the insurance buffs on everybody, and having my spenders give me cooldown reduction for my Divine Toll, so I had a good feedback loop of getting more Divine Tolls, giving me more spenders, giving me more Awakening uptime and Wings uptime, and then being able to get more Divine Tolls out of it. I like all those things a lot. I like how the gameplay works. I like the toolkit that you have for dungeons, but I feel that it so noticeably needs to get buffed. And I think we're really at a point right now for healing as a whole where it's just about output. The dungeons themselves, they've been steadily chipping away at the annoyance of like, you must have this dispel, or you must have that profile, or you must have this battle res, or something like that, right? There's still a couple of them left over, but it's way, way less than we've seen over the years. You know, it used to be every other dungeon would have a poison dispel that if you don't dispel, you just die. You know, it'd be like out of 10, you just die. They've been slowly eroding at those things. And so now it's really just coming down to this overall HPS number, and we still have a lot of time, of course. But I want to kind of highlight, and I've talked about it a lot with these other healers, is that yes, you can have some good toolkit pieces to the equation. You can have some really good, powerful utility in one way or another, but the ability to deal with these heal checks is the #1 absolute priority for the healer. That's what they're brought for. That's what you need to play around. We're not in Shadowlands anymore, where Sanguine Depths is the only heal check bosses, that healer damage was like the most important thing or anything like that. We've moved away from those really heavily since Dragonflight, in fact. You know, Mistweaver at the time was doing okay damage in like season 3, but it wasn't like the best DPS you'd ever seen, but it just healed through all of your problems. And that was what was needed for those dungeons. That trend has continued into the War Within with some just very brutal boss fight healing checks. And the healers that can best deal with that and reverse that incoming damage more easily are always going to be the ones that are going to be brought. And again, this is a way too early tier list. Maybe we're going to get lucky and a whole bunch of healer tuning is going to come in. Hopefully not before I publish this video. But, you know, maybe something is going to come in and start shifting up this equation. But I think, especially if they want Season 2 to be a banger, like some of the changes seem like they're going to be, they need to start making those tuning adjustments for 5-mans with a focus on 5-mans right about now. I really think the future for M+ healing is going to be that every healer does X% more healing in a 5-man, and that's a little tuning knob that they can adjust here and there. I think Paladin and Holy Priest absolutely need it in a very big way, and I think the specs like Disc Priest and Mistweaver, who have M+ only talents or M+ specific talents, are major beneficiaries because they're easier to tune between raids and M+. Somehow they're really, really strong in both. Who knew? But that's my rant for the day. Hope you guys at least found this illuminating. Please don't freak out that this is going to be something set in stone. I've been getting asked questions about tier lists for quite a while, and as a result, here it is, right? But don't freak out. It's still early. We still got, you know, the entirety of February, at least, I'd assume, till the patch drops. But we'll see. And along the way, I'll make sure I'm covering all of the content and all the changes for healers as we continue. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to our patrons for making all this content possible, and I'll catch y'all next time.